If you even casually peruse my videos on this YouTube channel, then you know I'm a fan of Star Trek. Specifically, the original series. Star Trek is an over 50-year-old franchise that is still telling new stories to this day and still generates dedicated fans from one generation to the next, no pun intended. Compared to some of the more serious shows the franchise has produced, like Deep Space Nine or Voyager, or even the edgelord trash pile reboot movies, the original series seems like cheap, campy, ridiculous schlock, which maybe isn't a completely unearned reputation. But that isn't all it is. For every bad special effect, cheap set, or hammy performance, there is a stirring monologue about morality, a deep philosophical question about what it means to be human, or an exploration as to what our own future holds for us as a species. Star Trek has lived on for so long for a reason. I believe that Star Trek is ultimately about hope. And in a time that can seem so dark, there is a desperate need for stories like that again. Which is why I've decided to do this episode guide on one of the most influential pieces of television in history. I want to encourage you to look past the low-budget production values and the awkward deliveries, because God, this show can be awkward at times. Star Trek is more than just a silly science fiction show from the 1960s. And if I can get at least one person to see that, I'll consider this channel a success. We're starting out with a Bones-centric episode, which there is a sad lack of. A landing party consisting of Captain James T. Kirk, Chief Medical Officer Dr. Leonard McCoy, aka Bones, and a blue shirt, beamed down to planet M113, where Kirk explains in voiceover a woman who Bones dated in the past resides with her husband, who is a scientist. Kirk's captain's logs usually serve as some quick and easy exposition. The original series' episode formula is the self-contained or Alien of the Week format, and we don't often see these planets or non-Enterprise crew characters again, so the quick introduction helps move the audience straight into the plot. The landing party meets Nancy Crater, who mysteriously appears to have different appearances to each of the landing party. Bones sees Nancy as he remembers her when they were dating, the not red shirt sees a woman he met on vacation, and Kirk sees exactly what he expects to see, a pretty woman about McCoy's age. It's interesting to note here that Kirk is the only one who sees Nancy as just a person, and not an object of romance like Bones, or sex like Darnell. Also, Nancy calls Bones Plum, which is plum adorable.
Plum.
Nancy follows Darnell outside and leads him away from the cave dwelling. I'm sure this will end well. Dr. Crater appears and rather rudely informs Kirk and Bones that he and Nancy don't need Starfleet to check in on them, which Kirk seems rather amused with. Bones and Kirk insist on conducting the medical checkups they're here for, and Crater gives in. He adds that they're in need of a resupply of salt. Bones comments that Nancy hasn't aged a bit, and Kirk comments that she is a bit older than 25. Then there's a shriek from outside, and Kirk and Bones rush out to find Nancy with the dead body of Darnell, our first point on the dead random crew member counter. They decide to postpone the examinations to investigate the cause of Darnell's death, and Nancy also mentions their request for salt. Why is Shatner so sweaty? Back on the ship, First Officer and Chief Science Officer Commander Spock is manning the bridge in Kirk's stead. Chief of Communications Lieutenant Uhura tries to connect with him. This is one of only 2 times in the series where I can see where the 2009 movie got the idea of pairing Spock and Uhura together. In any case, Spock doesn't seem all that responsive. Uhura points out that Spock is very unemotional when news arrives that a crewman is dead, and that it could be Kirk, the closest thing Spock has to a friend. Vulcans very famously suppress their emotions, a theme that will pop up with Spock's character again and again. However, it's worth noting that Spock is only half Vulcan, as his mother is human. Bones is stumped as to how Darnell died and seems to be distracted by romantic nostalgia over seeing Nancy again. Kirk reprimands him for not focusing on his job, displaying his devotion to taking care of his crew, one of my favorite of Kirk's traits. Damn, look at those Canadian hams. Sorry, that's gonna be a problem for me. He's so thick. Bones discovers that there's no salt in Darnell's body and surmises that it must have been sucked out through the, hickeys on his body.
Another error on my part. I'm not counting them, Bones.
How sweet are they? Kirk displays some of his often understated brilliance by remembering that both Crater and Nancy mention needing salt and drawing an obvious conclusion. They return to the planet to interrogate Crater, who remains obstinate. Kirk orders Crater and Nancy to come aboard the ship until they figure out what's going on, and Nancy kills 2 more randos. Nancy then disguises self as one of the dead crewmen and rejoins the landing party. Kirk says this.
Stop thinking with your glands.
Sorry, Green goes hunting for salt, and here's where we meet Janice Rand, who is bringing a tray of food to Helmsman Sulu in the botany lab. I love how Green reaches for the salt and Rand slaps his hand and then immediately eats a celery stalk off Sulu's plate. Also, Sulu's lunch consists of celery and multicolored cubes? Kinda looks like chopped up melon, but I can't be sure. Also, Rand is one of the best disses I've ever heard.
Why don't you go chase an asteroid?
Green follows Rand to the botany room, and one of Sulu's totally not a hand puppet plants reacts strongly to Green's presence. Green runs off and encounters Uhura in the hallway. It senses her loneliness from before when she was chatting up Spock, and takes the form of a handsome man to flirt with her. Uhura then delivers one of the sickest burns ever.
I see. So naturally, when I'm lonely, I think of you.
The shifter then advances on Uhura menacingly. Luckily, Rand and Sulu appear at that moment, allowing Uhura to escape, and the shifter seeks out a new unsuspecting victim. Eventually, it finds its way to McCoy's room and takes the form of Nancy, playing on McCoy's romantic feelings. Nancy lulls him into a false sense of security and coaxes him into falling asleep, then takes his form and reports for duty as Bones. Kirk and Spock return to the planet to try and reason with Crater again. Spock finds Green's body and deduces that they're dealing with a shapeshifter. Crater then begins shooting at them and demands they leave. Then we get one of those silly scenes Star Trek is known for of William Shatner darting around a cheap set made of styrofoam. Oh, the 60s. Kirk and Spock outsmart Crater, and Crater surrenders, explaining that the real Nancy was killed by the shifter, which took her form and sought asylum with Crater, being the last of its kind. Crater, despite his grief at losing Nancy, took pity on the shifter, but Kirk points out that the shifter is killing people and that keeping it alive is an immoral decision. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Or the one. Crater agrees to beam aboard. Kirk and Spock hold a staff meeting, not knowing that the shifter is right in their midst, and map out a plan to entrap the shifter. The shifter, as Bones, does a pretty bad job of convincing everyone it's not the shifter by defending itself as just trying to survive. Crater refuses to help the crew identify the shifter, and Spock suggests truth serum? Spock goes with the fake Bones to get it, and Bones knocks Spock out, and we get to see that Vulcans have green blood instead of red. The shifter also kills Crater and escapes back to Bones' room, again becoming Nancy and begging for help. Kirk arrives to kill the shifter, much to Bones' confusion. Nancy freezes Kirk in place and nearly, sucks him to death. Spock shows up and panics when he sees Kirk in danger, but Bones refuses to shoot. Spock attacks Nancy, but she/it easily overpowers him. Bones finally snaps out of it when the shifter briefly takes its natural form as a hideous monster and shoots. The shifter briefly becomes Nancy one more time to beg for mercy, but it's too late. And that's pretty much the end of that. The Man Trap was written by George Clayton Johnson, who also wrote the Twilight Zone episode The Four of Us Are Dying, a story that is also about a shapeshifter. There are plenty of science fiction stories about aliens and monsters taking the form of humans and living among them, but to me personally, this episode reminds me most of Who Goes There, a 1938 pulp science fiction/horror novella that spawned the 1951 film The Thing from Another World, and, more famously, John Carpenter's The Thing in the 1980s. In the story, a group of military officers and scientists accidentally unleash a carnivorous alien monster that, you guessed it, has the power to take the form of any living creature it wants. The suspense lies in not knowing who is who, as the alien slowly kills them off one by one and takes their identities, causing paranoia to rise among the humans. However, it's not quite the same since we're made aware from the very first scene that something is off about Nancy, and we're always shown who the shifter is impersonating. Wouldn't it have been more intriguing if there had been some question as to who the shifter was pretending to be? Or if they wanted us to empathize with the shifter, then they could have showed us some tender moments between Nancy and Crater before they reveal that she's a monster. Instead, she's pretty much killing people right from the get-go, making Crater's opinion that the shifter deserves pity seem insanely stupid. And then there's the whole "but Bones loves her" angle. Bones' arc in the episode is that he's so caught up with romance that it's affecting his job performance. But then he's asleep for half the episode, despite arguably being the focus character. Bones only snaps out of it when the shifter reveals its true form instead of realizing the error of his ways on his own. I think it would have been a stronger episode if Bones, A, had been awake to learn the important information, and B, if he'd had to shoot the shifter in Nancy's form after coming to grips with the fact that his old flame is dead and this monster is evil and killing people. Then you could have the shifter turn into its true form after it's dead to cement that fact. Why did the shifter change anyway? Didn't it realize that it had a better chance of having Bones on its side as Nancy? Maybe it has to change into its true form to suck people to death? I don't know. There's something else I'd like to point out here. In the first scene, Nancy seems to have different forms to different people at the same time, appearing as young Nancy to Bones, and mature Nancy to Jim, and the blonde woman to Darnell simultaneously, which would imply some kind of power to manipulate people's perceptions, but then it's shown that she physically shifts her form to fit whatever role she needs. Then again, with the way the actors are blocked, it seems like only one man at a time is looking at Nancy, but would she really change looks right in front of them? It's probably just a continuity error. However, Nancy obviously has some sort of telepathic ability since she's able to take on the persona of Darnell's dream girl without so much as a description of her, and is able to paralyze Kirk with just a look. I'm not saying I dislike this episode, in fact I like it quite a bit. There's plenty I love, like Spock's pratfall when the shifter hits him, Kirk crawling through sand, Uhura speaking Swahili, and the way DeForest Kelly acts like a shy schoolboy with a crush with Nancy. There's just places where it could have been improved. I'm gonna rate this episode an overall 7.5 out of 10. There's a lot to talk about in the world building of this show that's been touched upon, but we'll talk about it more over the course of these videos. For now, we'll leave it with what it is. One more thing, I'm reviewing these episodes in order of air date, not production, so you can easily follow along on your Netflix account. I've also skipped over the unaired pilot of The Cage, since we'll be covering it in the Menagerie Parts 1 and 2. I'm really excited about this, guys, and I hope you are too.